This submarine was originally a German Type 207, which was in service in the Norwegian Navy from 1964 to 1990 as a Copenhagen-class submarine. As part of the transfer to the Danish Navy, it was extended with about 2 meters to allow room for more equipment. The submarine is 47 meters long with a crew of 22. That makes it about 20 meters shorter than the German Type 7. Looking at the side of the submarine, we can see the hydrophone. This enabled the submarine to listen underwater in an arc of about 270 degrees, so almost all the way around. Of course, it had a blind spot at the stern of the submarine due to the noise generated by the propeller. To mitigate this blind spot, the submarine would from time to time perform a sweeping maneuver to check if something was behind it, much like seen in the movie The Hunt for Red October. If we look further towards the bow, we can see one of the 2 forward dive planes. What's a bit interesting is that these dive planes have a fixed angle when extended. So what you see here on the starboard side is the dive plane used to surface the submarine. So when this was extended, it would make the submarine go up. You will on the other side see the dive plane which was used to submerge the submarine. In other words, only one dive plane was extended at a time. The crew will refer to how the submarine looked as a happy whale or sad whale, depending on what dive plane was extended. Obviously, happiest when diving. Here at the bow of the submarine, we have the hatches for the 8 torpedo tubes. The top 2 was used to load the torpedoes when docked, but more on that when we are on the inside of the submarine. The torpedoes was controlled using a wire, and they had a sonar device at the top to identify when it was under a ship, so it would then trigger a detonation. A detonation under a ship was preferred over a contact torpedo detonation, as that would only create a hole on the side of the ship, whereas a detonation under the keel would break the keel and ensure that the ship was sunk. On the sail, we see the periscope, the snorkel and several antennas. The submarine would only approach the surface on patrol to snorkel to charge the batteries using the diesel engines. In other words, it would never surface during a patrol. The propeller shape was a secret for a long time, as a great deal of effort was put into designing and shaping it into something which was very, very quiet. On the aft, we can see the additional dive planes. This is the torpedo room where you can see the 8 torpedo tubes. As mentioned earlier, the top 2 tubes were used for loading the torpedoes. This was achieved by moving all the inside fixtures, except for the middle wall, starting all the way back at the galley, and then moving all of these fixtures outside the submarine and through that top hatch. The submarine was then trimmed, so the 2 top torpedo tube was raised out of the water. A loading system was mounted on the outside of the bow, and another system was set up inside the submarine to load the torpedoes through the top 2 tubes. Inside the submarine, the torpedoes was then shifted to the remaining 6 tubes. This was not a popular job, and it would take a well-trained team 7 hours to complete from start to finish. Above the forward ballast tank valve is located. A similar one for the aft ballast tank is located in the engineering space. This area is also where the enlisted men slept in shifts. On the right we have the sergeant's mess. This space was the home for 7 men. This crew worked in rotations and used hot bunking, so they took turns in sleeping and being on duty, which would put a strain on the people after 16 days underwater with a maximum of 3 hours sleep per cycle. On the left we find the officer's mess, which was also the home of 6 men plus the CEO. The captain's quarters we will visit later. Above you can see the greenish bags with numbers and letters on them. These are built breathing systems. These would supply the crew with clean air in the event of poisonous gas like chlorine gases from the batteries. Here we have what is referred to by the crew as the critical installation, the coffee machine. This is the galley. In this space all the food was prepared and food quality was very important to the crew. Breakfast was bacon, eggs, fresh baked bread, etc. Lunch was a hot meal and Danish open sandwiches, and dinners were either appetizers and a main course or main course and a dessert. The quality of the food was so important that during the mission to sail the submarine from Norway to Denmark, the first enlisted cook was replaced and a new one was actually flown in. It's hard to imagine today, but back then when this submarine was in service, smoking was actually permitted on board, and they did smoke. This is the control room, and on the right you can see the map table used for plotting and navigation. Further out is the listening station using to detect contacts underwater. The submarine has an ability to listen underwater using the hydrophones, and the crews working here were so good that they could tell the difference between the frigate Peder Skram and its sister ship, just by listening to the differences in the propeller noises. Next to it we have the fire controls for the torpedoes. The submarine was also equipped with an underwater telephone, which could be used to conduct communications with the surface, but it was rather limited in its ability to send clear signals. Then we have the periscope, which was the captain's and the submarine's eyes. When the submarine was nearing the surface, the captain would have the periscope raised and do a very quick sweep to see if something on the surface. Remember, if a surface ship was not sailing, the hydrophones could not pick up the propeller noise, so the submarine couldn't know what was on the surface. So the captain would only know what was actually there when he first looked through the periscope. This is the area for the navigation of the submarine and the dive controls. You can see one red chair, but originally had 2 additional chairs installed, used for helm, dive control and the machinist controlling the trim tanks. As you can imagine, this didn't leave much space for people to pass by. Here we have a very important instrument, the saline measuring. This was important due to the rather big changes in the amount of salt in the waters around in the Baltic Sea and Denmark. This would substantially impact how heavy or light the submarine would be, so in order to stay in control of the submarine's dive and buoyancy, it was critical to constantly be aware of the salt levels. Next to it is the snorkel. This is what enabled the submarine to stay hidden underwater during the charging of the batteries, and was also used to circulate the air inside the submarine. If you look closely, you can see that the gauges and labels are fluorescent, so in emergency with loss of electricity and thus light, they could turn on a black light, which enabled them to see the gauges information without even having another light source. By the sheet of the machinist is the location of the trim controls. Among the responsibilities was to ensure that there was always a full tank, which could be emptied in case the submarine needed to surface at speed. It was also required to keep a tank empty in case quick dive was needed. He had 12 tanks to work with in total. As part of the additions made to this submarine, a shower was installed. It could use both salt water and fresh water, but in order to conserve the supply of fresh water, this was not used, except in cases where the captain had to go into a meeting straight after entering port. In those cases, he would allow himself a freshwater shower. For the crew, a saltwater shower was not very attractive either, and it was a rather itchy experience, so this was rarely used. Here is the fridge and the freezer. This is the captain's quarters, and there's still a picture of his wife and children hanging on the wall. This machine was responsible for calculating the location of the submarine when it was submerged, based on location information gathered when snorkeling. This is where the radio operator worked, and you can still see the telegraph key sitting on the table used to transmit Morse code. And yes, it was actually used. This is the location where a great deal of the machinery was controlled and, for example, where CO2 or oxygen tests were done. If the oxygen levels got too low, pure O2 could be added. However, the crew was then not allowed to smoke while this was happening. In this location, the CO2 filters were also located, so CO2 could be removed from the air. This was also the location where the speed of the submarine was actually controlled. Above is the valve for the diesel engine exhaust. The exhaust was released into the water at approximately 5 meters depth during the snorkeling operation. If the submarine was detected during snorkeling and it had to perform an emergency dive, somebody had to close this valve at very high speed, as the dive would not wait for somebody to confirm that this valve had been closed. Due to this, someone had to have a hand on the handle for the entire snorkeling operation. There was also a harness, so this operator would not slide into operations during a 30-degree emergency dive. At the same time as the operator would close the valve, a machinist has to run into the engine room and stop the diesels, which could be challenging with a 30-degree down angle. Above is the aft main balance tanks valve, which was used to dive the submarine. This is the submarine's toilet. This is where the submarine's two 12-cylinder Mercedes diesel engines are located. These are not mirrored, which means that to access the controls on the port diesel, it was not accessible from the central passage. You had to crawl in behind the engine itself. At the end, two generators are located, one for each diesel engine. These were responsible for transforming the energy from the diesels into electricity, which was then stored in the batteries. In the aft center, the electric motor is located, which is connected to the propeller. This concludes the walkthrough of this submarine, and I hope you enjoyed it. I only publish new content maybe once per year, so ensure you subscribe to get a notification when that happens. And on that note, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.